What happened at the Sounds Profitable Business Leaders Summit? What are the dynamic ad insertion and video ad trends among our sponsors? How is Tom's dog Walnut doing? That's what we're talking about today on a special Sounds Profitable Ad Tech Applied with Arielle NissenblattProduced and Tom Webster. This episode was streamed live via Twitter Spaces, so if things sound a little bit different, that's why.
Welcome to Sounds Profitable Ad Tech Applied. My name is Arielle NissenblattProduced, and I am the community manager at Squadcast. I also help Sounds Profitable with social media and with this podcast, and I'm excited to be interviewing Tom Webster here, who is a partner at Sounds Profitable, and we are going to be talking live today on Twitter Spaces. So if my audio quality does not sound as amazing as it usually does, blame Twitter Spaces, but also thank you to Twitter Spaces for enabling us to have this conversation live in front of an audience. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope my audio is okay as well. I think I tried like 100 different ways to get a microphone into my phone today, and I don't think any of them worked.
No, yeah, I am recording with a bad method, which the Squadcast guys would be mad at me for, which is that I'm using AirPods. So I really hope this comes out okay and that there's no latency or anything that comes out with that. But we are here and we're going to talk about Podcast Movement. We're going to talk about the Business Leaders Summit at Podcast Movement. And we're going to talk about the After These Messages research report. And we're also going to talk about your dog. We're not really going to talk about your dog, but I just love how much you love Walnut. So that might come up.
I was here to talk about my dog. So my dog had to get the cone of shame this week, and that lasted about 5 minutes. So for those who don't know, I have a retired racing greyhound. He's large. He's a long boy. And the only cone of shame that would work on him was like the XL cone of shame. And so he basically wanders around the house like a drunk satellite dish. So we had to take that off.
Oh, so is he doing okay post-surgery?
Yeah, it was actually just a hot spot that we wanted him to stop licking. So that was it.
Okay, so cone of shame for hot spot. Got it.
Yeah, that'll teach him.
Okay, cool. I feel like it's never going to be enough Walnut talk, but I'm glad we started it off like that. So I'm glad that that Walnut has entered the conversation. Let's pivot to Podcast Movement. So Tom, Podcast Movement took place last week in Dallas. I had a lot of fun, maybe too much fun. I'm still tired, still going off of sleep deficit, but it was extremely fruitful and extremely successful. I had so many conversations. I'd love to hear from your perspective. How was your first Podcast Movement as a member of the Sounds Profitable team?
It was amazing. And I've been to Podcast Movement a whole bunch of times, so success number one, I did not get COVID. Like anytime I go anywhere, I'm counting that as success number one. But this was also our first Sounds Profitable Business Summit. And it was kind of cool being there, really as someone focused on podcasting full time, which I've never been able to do in my whole career until now. So now I really feel like, I was with my peoples.
You really were. And the peoples loved you, and it was lovely. So let's talk about what started it off, which was on Tuesday, the Sounds Profitable Business Leaders Summit. Tell us about how that came to be, and then I'll ask you questions about the actual day.
Yeah, Brian Barletta, my partner, and I really, there have been a number of meetings in the past that were very focused on really on the leaders in the industry, right? And I participate in everything with independents all the way up. But getting kind of the leaders in the space together in one room, it hasn't happened in a while, and it doesn't happen very often. The atmosphere in podcasting, I think, is necessarily gone from collegial to competitive at that level. But we really wanted to try and get everybody together and try to talk about some of the issues that are impacting the business side of podcasting. There's all kinds of little frustrations I have with the business side of things. Different companies talk about their metrics in different ways. They talk about what the most important metrics are to them in different ways. And then, when advertisers talk to those various companies and they're kind of hearing different stories, they can get a little frustrated with the space. And I think that all gets fixed by actually getting people together in a room. So Brian and I put this together. Brian really did the lion's share of the work on this. And we invited people who were already sponsors of Sounds Profitable, which we have over 100 and really the top companies in the space. And we invited them to bring, 2 or 3 people from their company and get together and do some really interesting panels. We did a panel on video, and we were fortunate enough to have Stephanie Chan from YouTube there. We did a panel on the various types of metrics and measurement in podcasting right now. We did a panel on programmatic advertising, and then we presented what is our second research study, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But it was kind of cool. We didn't have any press in there. It was really before the main event for Podcast Movement started, so it was just a way to have a frank exchange of views, as one might say.
One might say that, yeah, and one might be right. It was a really great event. I was there. Got there very early. Got to enjoy the Disney sponsored breakfast. Shout out to our sponsors. We had some lovely sponsors throughout the day, and I really liked the joke that you made, which was that it was, what was it, Dallas chef contest. What am I trying to say?
We had 4 different kind of food / coffee breaks. Yeah, two from Disney Advertising, 2 from Wondery, and they were all kind of different. So I was pitting them against each other to fight for our love in Top Chef Dallas, and I don't know. I have to call it a tie.
Okay, yeah. Who can do it better next time? We'll just have to find out with some new sponsors, or with these sponsors coming back for more.
Or I'll cook.
Great idea. So really, I thought it was an extremely successful event. The first 3 panels were great. And what was great about it was that Brian at the beginning made an announcement where he said, not that there's anything secretive going on in here, but so that there's no pressure for the folks who are up on stage, we're not really going to have people taking notes. I mean, we're not really going to have people tweeting. We're not really going to have people blogging about this, just frank conversation about the industry. And what do you think that did for the vibe in the room?
I think it relaxed people. And I think from the very first panel on, the video panel, when you're sort of with especially a publicly traded company, the spokespeople for that publicly traded company can't really go out and tell shareholders, we don't know what we're doing. But in a lot of cases, everybody is still figuring things out. And I think it just kind of created a space where people could say, look, we are still figuring this out. This is what we're trying. We think this part works. We don't know about this part. And, it just kind of let everybody talk about the space in a little bit more of an open way, and also kind of talking about the economy, right? If you read Twitter, Arielle, and I don't know if you do, but if you do,
yeah, I'm not on here very often.
Exactly. We're often told about, that the economy is soft, potentially a recession and things like that. And it's kind of just good to talk to everybody and see, is that really the case or not the case? And that's the kind of room where you can have those conversations in. So it was a tremendous success. And honestly, we had about 300 people in there, and it was just kind of overwhelming to me, especially as someone who's been in the space, and I hope given a lot to the space over the last 18 years, to kind of see it all paid back with the just enthusiasm and just love of people in the room for what Brian and I had put together.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought overall incredible event, and we're going to get in a second to what I think of as the main event, mostly just because it was open to everybody, which is the After These Message research report. But before that, I would love if you'd share one takeaway from any of the panels, that might help the folks at home who are listening, whether they're independent creators or part of larger networks. What is something that we can share from within those first 3 conversations that might help folks?
Yeah, I would say that a really good thing you can do when things don't seem settled in the space is to try and organize as best you can, try and unite with other voices, and take strong positions. One of the things that certainly made a little bit of news last week was that, YouTube had put up a podcast page, youtube.com/podcasts. And, it's clearly a work in progress, right? But it's a work in progress because it actually still is a work in progress. And I think if podcasters are sort of vocal and united enough about the kinds of things you would like to see there, that there's a chance to influence the space at every level. So that, I think that's, nothing's ever really set in stone. You can have a position, you can have a public position, but ultimately everything in business is extremely fluid. And I think if people can speak with one voice as much as possible, I know that's sort of difficult in the podcasting space, but it really helps the space with advertisers, with potential partners like YouTube, with agencies, with buyers, and so that's the thing that I would really want to get across to people is find things you can agree on and be kind of loud and proud about them.
For the folks who are joining us live on Twitter Spaces right now, just a reminder that you can remind us that you are here, that you are active participants by throwing us an emoji. All you have to do is go to the bottom of your screen, hit the heart button, and then choose an emoji, and we will be very happy to know that you're here participating with us. And also, if you have a question or a comment, all you have to do is hit the button on the bottom right of the screen that has a little chat bubble. We'd love to hear your questions and comments because at the end of our conversation, we may read some of those out loud and then respond to you. And that'll be a really cool way for you to be on the Sounds Profitable Ad Tech Applied podcast, which is live right now, but it will also be on our podcast feed later this week. All right, Tom, let's go to After These Messages. How did you and Brian come up with the title? First of all, I know that there's some contention around that you'll talk about, but also the conceit of the study.
Well, Brian came up with the name, and I'm still bitter about that, right? Because I'm supposed to have all the good ideas, and this was the good idea that I didn't have. And it's if you've ever watched ABC back to school specials, they always have these little animated claymation. After these messages, we'll be right back, kind of interstitials. And I may be showing my age here. I'm nearly 30. But I remember these, and they're super funny, super fun, and I think that title really brings that whole image back to mind, right? But it is a study about advertising, and one of the things that really inspired Brian and I to put this study together is that there's a lot of bashing of DAI advertising, programmatic advertising as the devil. But the listener doesn't know what's DAI and what's programmatic. All that they know is, was it host read or not? So what we wanted to do was take 3 different creative executions of essentially the same ad. One that was a live ad-libbed version by a host. One that was a scripted version, very clearly a scripted version, but by the host. And then a third version, which was a quality, well-produced announcer read version of the same script that the host had used for the scripted version. And we had great partners on this. We used Jordan Harbinger from obviously the Jordan Harbinger show helped us. We took a great content segment from one of his shows. It was an interview with Matthew McConaughey, a large sample of people and a large sample of Jordan's own listeners, which we were able to kind of do comparisons with. And a third of the sample got each one of those 3 treatments of advertising. And so basically what we wanted to see was if you did a quality job on all 3 versions, was there an inherent benefit to the live ad lib read versus the scripted versus the announcer? And the study came back just so clean. It was over 1,000 podcast listeners, 300 of which were existing listeners to Jordan's show, which again fell naturally. Which we knew if we picked a big enough show, we would do well there. And the results were kind of amazing. And really, no matter where you fall in terms of podcast advertising and kind of what your beliefs are, there's something in the study to support that. Overall, the live ad lib read did the best in terms of things like unaided recall of the brand and fit with the podcast and things like that. However, when you look at Jordan's own listeners, the people who say that they were existing listeners to Jordan's show, all 3 did well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the announcer read version really fit the ethos of the show. It fit the mood of the show. It wasn't a big, screaming, terrible ad. It was a really good ad. And also, Jordan kind of warms it up, right? He's already conditioned his listeners to, hey, this is an advertiser that helps me out here. So it really fascinating findings kind of all the way around. And I think cases to be made for the use of both host read and announcer read and in different situations.
And the After These Messages study is available for folks to check out both the slide deck and the actual presentation that you gave. It was recorded live. Where can folks go to find and rewatch that?
That's soundsprofitable.com. Look on the under the research tab. You'll see that along with our first study, which was the Creators, which came out in June.
And I really recommend checking out the study. Even if you only have time to just look at the slides, you can use those slides for your decks. You can use those slides to prove that host-read ads work, but so do other ad format types. So I really enjoyed this study. I live tweeted it. If you want to see my analysis, you could just click on my profile and scroll back a little bit. I thought it was a really great presentation. And what was really cool is that it actually was available a little bit earlier to Sounds Profitable sponsors. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, so we make available I actually do a full presentation of the study for the companies that sponsored it, and get a chance to answer their questions so that everybody's fully prepared. And I've got a long career in media research. I'm committed to truth telling. Very committed to telling the most accurate story that I can, and hopefully it's a story that pushes the medium forward. I think this one does. But you don't, with sponsors who support this work and make it possible, we wanted them to feel like that they had, kind of an inside track on it. But that said, editorial control of everything rests with Brian and I. But we're delighted to be able to give sponsors a preview of it.
And what's next for Sounds Profitable in terms of research?
So in the fourth quarter, we're going to be tackling brand safety and brand suitability, which is a really hot topic right now. And we had really a fantastic portion of a panel on that at the Sounds Profitable Business Summit. And, it's obviously a very hot topic. We're going to be looking at things like politics. We're going to be looking at other, kinds of content that people might find questionable. And advertisers can be wary of spending money in the space because, to their mind, they don't know what kind of content their ads are going to run on. But there is existing technology out there to help that. And, one of the things that is sort of a limiting belief that could actually be harmful, not just to podcasting, but to society, is if you go through as an advertiser and say, well, I don't want to advertise on things that talk about politics, or I don't want to advertise on things that talk about COVID or guns. And all of a sudden, what you've basically done is defund the news. And that's not good for anyone because that's what the news talks about, right? So we want to get a sense, that's the advertiser perspective. But what we really don't have so much is the consumer perspective, the listener perspective. How much are they really put off by certain types of content? Do they take it out on the podcast or not? Does the content of the podcast impact how they see the advertiser from that perspective? So it's a really hot topic in the space, and we're going to have a very compelling look at that in the fourth quarter.
And listeners, you can stay up to date with all of Sounds Profitable's upcoming research and articles by going to soundsprofitable.com. And you can subscribe to the newsletter there so that you're the first to know about everything. Tom, let's talk a bit about the rest of the conference, about the rest of Podcast Movement, which took place last week in Dallas. I'm sure you were very busy, but were you able to attend any panels?
Yeah, I attended a few and I was on a few. And a couple that were super interesting to me. I did a metrics panel, and it's funny because I'm a statistician, not a digital marketer per se. And I think, if you're a digital marketer, you're very used to numbers that look like, kind of census data. This is exactly how many impressions I got. This is exactly how many ads were served and things like that. But the truth is those things are all estimates. And, someone with my training, I'm sort of used to that tolerance for ambiguity. But it's funny to be on a panel about metrics and have somebody in the audience say, I'm having two different services count my downloads and they're coming up with different numbers. Which one do I believe? And, my answer is yes, right? Because they're both sort of in the ballpark and both are estimates. And I think people don't really necessarily understand that or see it that way. And I think it can be kind of harmful, I think, to us when some companies talk about downloads. Other companies say, no, it's about impressions. Other companies will say, actually, no, we count listens. And all of that, may be true, and it may be to make competitive points and things like that. But ultimately, it's confusing for buyers. And so I think, getting our story straight is going to be helpful for the media, I think, in the future. The other panel I really enjoyed, one that I sat on, was one on branded podcasts. And I'm a huge believer in branded podcasts to do something very, very different from what a typical podcast does. I mean, if you're a company and you want to grow your reach, grow your customer base, a branded podcast is not the way to do it. And I think that's a huge misconception. And I think it affects how branded podcasts get sold, because you're not going to grow a huge audience with a branded podcast with a few exceptions, right? A few outliers. But, one of the things that I think you can do with a branded podcast is change how people feel about your company. And that may be really, really important, right? It might be really important if you're a company that kind of needs to tell a different story than it has been telling. I think that's important. And I think it's also valuable for companies that people are curious about. There are companies that people are curious about. Trader Joe's is a very big example here, and a very successful branded podcast. Other companies, Patagonia and things like that, people are curious about. So why not reward that curiosity? So that was another panel I really enjoyed. But, ultimately, the one thing that I think is really clear to me about podcasting is that podcasting still needs to tell the metrics story a little better. And, if I hear one more time from an advertiser that, it's the wild, wild west.
We're done with that.
Actually, the metrics are awesome. And if you've bought radio or TV for the last 40 years and you're complaining about podcasting, shame on you, because those metrics are awful.
It's the calm, we understand it East. Is there an opposite of the wild, wild west? Should be.
It's the civilized East, which, as someone who lives in the civilized East, I'm entirely behind.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for that recap of Podcast Movement and the Business Leaders Summit. We're going to get to questions in just a moment. We have one question already from Trisha. Friedman. Shout out to Trisha. If there are any other questions, now is the time to hit the button on the bottom right of the screen where there's a little chat bubble. You can leave a question, a comment. We would love to hear from you. I'll be reading those questions, comments out loud in a second. While Tom while we wait for your questions to come about, I'll just say that this is a live taping on Twitter Spaces. This podcast is actually going to be in the Sounds Profitable feed, so you can subscribe to that podcast at Sounds Profitable Ad Tech. You can subscribe to that podcast, and that's why I'm repeating myself. You can subscribe to the Sounds Profitable Ad Tech Applied podcast by going to soundsprofitable.com. You'll find everything you need right there. Tom, what are you listening to lately? What podcast are you listening to? While we get some more comments in the chat, what are you listening to?
I just binged Fed Up on Wondery, which I know I'm not the only one. That I thought that was really well produced, and Casey Wilson, who narrated it, is fantastic. What a natural she is. So that was the most recent thing I listened to.
I am also listening to that and agree with you completely. Wondery has it on lock. They know exactly what they're doing in terms of hooking their listeners. Yeah,
and to me, it really shows the power of letting a narrator, letting a host kind of be themselves, because this to me felt like Casey Wilson knew this story cold, and she was telling it to me at a party. It's very, very personable, extremely well produced. So kudos to Wondery for that one.
That's a great read of it. All right, let's get to Trisha's question. Can you speak to a collaboration you're seeing in the industry that's groundbreaking and bound to create a new trend? A collaboration that you're seeing in the industry that is groundbreaking and is bound to create a new trend.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about actually creating a trend, but let's just say giving us another look at it. I was encouraged to see YouTube and NPR partner last week to start getting some of their content on, and I think it's, especially with the kind of content that NPR produces, it may not immediately translate to YouTube, right? But to me, that kind of a partnership says that, NPR wants to try it and YouTube is willing to, bend a little bit. Let's see how we can make this work a little bit better. Because as I've been saying at Podcast Movement for years and another fora, it's YouTube is an important part of podcast discovery. And if we can figure that out, we talk a lot about the quote unquote podcast discovery problem, but discovery on YouTube is solid, right? Like, how many times have you gone to watch a video and then immediately watched something else that was recommended to you? And I think my hope is for the industry that if that starts to become a more learned behavior, that what gets recommended to you in the right column there is in fact another podcast and not just a popular video. So that's the thing I think we all need to be vocal about and talk about. But that kind of a collaboration, to me, like any company can say, we want to get our stuff on YouTube, but YouTube partnering with NPR to try to find a better, more listener/viewer friendly way to do that, that's encouraging to me.
Agreed. Thank you for that question, Trisha, and thank you, Tom, for the answer. We have 2 more questions that rolled in, so I'm going to read them, and hopefully we can get to them very quickly. Here we go. From Steve Ellington. How do you feel about funding podcasts via direct listener support versus something or via something like Patreon versus running ads? I'm a big public radio listener, so have always liked that model. Again, that question is, okay, go ahead. You got it.
Yeah, it's a false choice. I think for podcasting to do more than survive, but to thrive, I think every revenue model available to it has to be pursued. And I think that's really kind of a listener choice. And I think for a lot of public media listeners, for instance, they are used to supporting programming directly. So why would you fight that, right? And in other cases, people are not. And so that really becomes a learned behavior. So to me, offering as much choice, having as many potential ways to make money on your podcast as possible is the smart answer here, I think. So how do I feel about them? I like them both.
So there really is no versus in your mind. Really
No.
Do it all.
Yeah, it's a false choice.
Next up and last up from Marcus DePaula, can you explain in simple terms the difference between DAI and programmatic ads and which platforms offer options for utilizing each type?
Wow. Not at the time that we have. That is a really deep conversation. But a programmatic is a way to buy and sell ads. DAI is how they're delivered. Yeah, that's a more in-depth question than I think we're going to get to here.
But I do think that we have some articles that have covered that question and all of its complexities on soundsprofitable.com. And if you're not yet subscribed, I definitely recommend subscribing to that newsletter. Tom, anything to add before we close it out?
You're a very good Twitter spacer.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everybody who joined us live, and to the folks who are going to be listening to this later, which I hope some of you folks will tune in to the podcast or at least get subscribed to it. So that you can check out future episodes and our amazing back catalog. Have a great day, everybody, and happy listening.
And that was Sounds Profitable, Ad Tech Applied. Listeners, as you've heard from Arielle before, we want to hear from you. Please reach out if you have any questions or comments. We're on Twitter at Sounds Profitable News, at Webby2001, or at Ari This and That. If you'd like to email us, hit us up at podcast@soundsprofitable.com. Want more from Sounds Profitable? We have 2 other podcasts, Sounds Profitable, the narrated articles, and The Download, a podcast about the business of podcasting, all available on this feed. Thank you to Omny Studios for hosting this podcast and for Spooler for being the tools behind how we build each episode.